Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talese.
I'm Scott Aiken.
We are the authors of Political Argument in a Polarized Age and Why We Argue and How We Should, among other things. We're continuing in this episode with a series that we've called The Trouble With. And this is, Scott's going to kick us off on The Trouble with Wittgenstein.
The trouble with Wittgenstein. So the trouble with Wittgenstein is not that he, when he was a teacher, beat his children or beat the students. You know the story without that?
Yeah.
That he beat the students, but the parents complained that he beat the girls. But the reason why he beat the girls was because of the fact that he expected them to learn mathematics. But the parents complained not that he was beating the girls, but that he was expecting the girls to learn mathematics. Okay, so that's an insane story. Him beating his students and expecting them to learn math. But the trouble with Wittgenstein is that a lot of the Wittgenstein stuff, it's unclear exactly what's happening, especially in the later Wittgenstein. What exactly is the result? What exactly is the reasoning that's happening? A very famous example is the private language argument. There's no private language. It's supposed to be the conclusion of the private language argument. But I defy anyone to point to where the private language argument begins.
Oh, in the investigations.
In the investigations,
Right.
in the philosophical investigations, where does it begin? What's the first premise of, like, if someone were to just say, like, look, it's a series of observations, it's a series of joshings or something like that. It's like, well, that's not an argument. That's something else. Like, is a joke an argument? Is see this as a tiger an argument? Or like see this as a fog an argument?
Now take the fog away.
Now take the fog away. Yeah, Jerry Fodor joke. So that's the first problem with Wittgenstein, which is it's not entirely clear where I'm coming from and where he's trying to take us, and what the method is to it. I'm pretty sure as to where he's trying to take us. But for the most part, it's mostly just a sort of a picture of where we're supposed to be, and like a picture of you after you've been made a Wittgensteinian, and the contemptuous picture of you before you got converted.
Right. So let me see if I can't sort of characterize this slightly differently. And we're talking here now mainly about the later Wittgenstein.
Later Wittgenstein.
Okay.
Yes.
Because there's a problem with the early Wittgenstein too. But maybe the problem with
none of it can be said. I think.
Yeah.
Can we say the problem too? We just did. Bertrand Russell already beat me to that joke.
So the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations of uncertainty and other of those sort of later Wittgensteinian works is constantly telling you to do things.
Yes.
It's constantly saying, do this. Don't do that. Don't ask, look, Don't do this other thing. And at the end of the day, the justification for all of the commanding that's going on, and by the way, it is puzzling in a book about investigations how much of it is really an interrogation.
Philosophical directives.
Yeah. It's sort of, did you think this?
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah, right. So it's a weirdly constructed work of philosophy that is constantly commanding you in various ways without giving you any indication of why you're supposed to do the thing that is being asked of you. So it's oddly, at least when I read it, I can't remember the last time I read it, but when I read it, especially as a graduate student and read it for the first time seriously, I was struck by how
guru-ish it came across, as though
it came across that way, but
more
also
like a kind of,
it was an exercise of authority over the reader.
Yes. Again, more directives.
Yeah, that's how I felt like I was being forced to submit to somebody who declared himself an authority, which I don't like. So but so there are a lot of directions. So there are a lot of directives, a lot of commands, and ultimately, the justification that comes out for having obeyed or complied with those commands is that when you do that, things will look a certain way to you.
Yes.
And once you see once you see things in that light or through that frame, you'll be happier,
different,
you'll be glad,
you'll be different.
You'll be the kind of person who wants to see them that way.
That's right.
So there is an almost like L.A. Paul kind of transformative experience that like you will become the kind of person that wants to look at the world the way that I'm telling you now to look.
And you'll endorse that change
Yeah.
once you're on the other side, and you'll reflect back on the prior you and be like, what an alien
So there's
and weirdo
so there's a
person
kind
that
of like
was.
I couldn't give you the reason why you ought to do this, because all of the reasons why you ought to do it are legible only to somebody who's already done the thing.
Already on the inside.
Which, that's the cultish feature of the book, of the view.
Of the whole, and the rhetoric of the program. Because, I mean, like, think, for example, of how so many of the arguments of uncertainty work, where they all work from him just effectively saying, like, nobody does it that way. And you're like, nobody talks about knowledge that way. And the answer is, there's a whole tradition of folks like, there was a fellow by the name of Aristotle who did that. Like, what are you talking about?
And his response is, I'll teach you differences.
And then the crucial thing is that then even whenever you say back, well, there are whole traditions that do this. He'll say things like, well, imagine that we were sitting on a park bench and someone came upon us with me asking it, do I know if that's a tree? And they're like, what the hell's going on over here? And he says, oh, we're only philosophizing. Wir nur philosophieren is how it goes. And you're like, but you could say, all you have to change is one word. Wir philosophieren doch. We're philosophizing over here.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. It's like it's all built into the way that he just characterizes everything. If you just change a nur and a doch, now you get the traditional philosophy back, but it's all this downplaying, it's all in the rhetoric of the presentation of the view. And somehow it's supposed to, once you play along, you internalize that, and now you have got this kind of, I don't know, like it's almost like Wittgenstein is supposed to be a kind of a deprogramming program, but it's more like a reprogramming program.
Yeah.
It feels like I'm being trained to think differently. And again, on the other side of it, presumably you feel like you've had some sort of major transformation. But again, it feels really cultish.
Well, so I think it's useful here to think about that point from the point of view of the person who's just finished the investigations, who has complied with all of the commands and has had this transformative, this gestalt shift in how they see everything, and feeling good, like this opens whole new vistas and all the rest. It's important to, like, okay, like that's one of the prizes if you submit to Wittgenstein in this way. But then when you see the group manifestation of
I was going to say exactly that.
That's where things start looking to me like some of my own individual suspicions as I was sitting as a graduate student in a seminar on Wittgenstein's investigations, puzzling and like, why am I constantly being told to do something by this guy? Who the hell is he? Right? Like, okay, well, whatever. But then when I started...
But if it takes hold...
Yeah, when I started seeing how Wittgensteinians operate, then I said, oh, now I see what... It's like, it's not just me being like, hey, don't tell me what to do. I'm like, don't tell me what to do. And I can now see why there's some virtue in the... Don't tell me what to do.
I don't want to be like that. So and there were plenty of philosophical schools that have kind of worked this way. So Pythagoreanism worked this way. Epicureanism worked this way. It's like they regularly just argued from ipse dixit, which was you find the thing in the text and then you keep it alive, right? And so there are long-standing traditions that work this way, but Wittgensteinians work this way. So all the arguments about hinge epistemology and the arguments for hinge epistemology, for the most part, effectively think that they have successfully argued for hinge epistemology from properly interpreting Wittgenstein.
Yeah, that's right.
And there are other cultish philosophical programs that work this way, like the phenomenon of for Dewey is effectively works as a premise introduction for
Ayn Rand.
or Ayn Rand. All of these other sort of religious philosophical associations that effectively work like religious associations. But this seems to be a sort of a pretty regular phenomenon where at least in my little in one place in my little sandbox is this hinge epistemology stuff, and for the most part they think that they've successfully argued for hinge epistemology by successfully introducing an interpretation of Wittgenstein's. It was like, well, I am convinced that this is the correct interpretation of what Wittgenstein said about hinge epistemology. There seems to be a giant leap from then to say that is correct. A, that there are hinges, and B, that they work that way. But that seems to be the sort of the strategy, which is that they say ipsy dixit, he said it, and so as a consequence, once we interpret properly interpret what he said, we will have fixed this as a premise, and we no longer have to have it embedded in he said. It is.
Right. So then the trouble with Wittgenstein so far seems to be the methodology, the cultishness
Right.
of the way the text is designed to be read. I mean, it's not just that people have, it's not like with art as experience, where people read art as experience and they become, these sort of like Dewey, monks of Dewey. It's not like that, because that book is not, nothing that Dewey wrote is meant to sort of charm you into being a Deweyan.
Right.
It's hard, terrible reading. I mean, it's not really elegant prose, let's put it that way. The Wittgensteinian view,
Suffer unto truth.
the Wittgensteinian stuff is written in a way that's supposed to, because it from the get-go claims a kind of authority over you. It's not just I'm the authority. I've been thinking about this stuff a long time. I'm an authority on this topic. It's the authority over the reader that gets asserted on page 1. So that's one problem. But what about the doctrines? I was like, there are games that are played on a field. There are games that are played on a table. There are games where you keep score. There are games where there's a referee. There are games where you need cards. There's games where you don't need cards, but you need dice. There are games where you have to be standing up. There are games where you need to be sitting down.
What is the doctrine
of family
resemblance?
Right. So
what is the doctrine of family resemblance?
And
I'm unsure whether or not it's actually true.
I don't know that it's actually true. I'm not sure it's coherent. What's a family resemblance?
What is a family resemblance?
What is a family resemblance?
Are we talking about the dog looking like everybody else?
And, Wittgenstein, in introducing the idea that there are only family resemblances, not things like essences or what it is to be of a particular kind of thing. It's like, one guy has got the same forehead, the other person's got the same nose, somebody's got, family resemblance is this whole, different kind of, different things, and they're resembled by way of different kinds of connections.
You have to have the concept of family first.
Well, that's and resemblance
and resemblance.
And by the way, I thought that the fact that you couldn't, the thing that undermined the idea that there's an essence to game, right, was that there are some games that are similar to other games in these ways. Are these really different theses at the end of the day? It seems to me. I'm not so sure that they are. Because by the way, the family resemblance view becomes everything that is in the same category is in the same category in virtue of one thing, whatever the instantiation of the family resemblance
whatever
is.
That is.
So all the things that are properly called board games, which by the way is one of the examples. Well, there are board games. There are games that are played on a field. Oh, do all the board games then have something in common? Yeah, the board.
The boards. So
I don't think the arguments are very good. That's
the examples. So one puzzle here is: could you improve the examples? Could they improve? And the answer is maybe. And leave it to the Wittgensteinians. I think the other part of it is the contempt with which Wittgenstein treats
G.E. Moore.
Somebody who, by the way, saved his bacon. By the way, at least in terms of just getting his doctorate and so on. But just right, all the contempt that he treats G.E. Moore and the contempt that he treats almost any other philosophical view that isn't his. It's almost as though he thinks that he is. I mean, this is the sort of smartest guy in the room problem, and apparently he really suffered from it, or maybe others suffered from it. And
except Frank Ramsey.
Yeah, right. Well,
cut him down to size, but good.
But here's one of the things, which is just that if you're a Wittgensteinian and you've internalized a good deal of that program, a good deal of the rest of philosophy just looks like garbage to you.
Yeah.
And just given other kinds of commitments that you and I share about, just, you might say, good faith philosophical argument, starting from that position and that being a substantive view about your philosophical program is just poison to substantive philosophy. Like, in some ways, you can't hear a criticism from outside except as confusion.
Right. That's right. And it's so monological in that way that it's almost, there's a joke somewhere in there that it's sort of a, there's no private language. It's only public language. But once you see that, there's really nothing to say because everybody
should already know what they're doing.
Everybody already is inclined to say the same stuff.
Yeah.
Then how
do we get so? Then what exactly is being confused by grammar?
Yeah. But at the end of the day, it really just is slab.
Slab here. Slab. Oh man.
Philosophy15, folks. That's the trouble with Wittgenstein.
Slab. All right, that was